LGBTQ1 laws. So to explore these subjects further, the work of political scientists will certainly be instrumental, but additional research will still be required. I think, for example, that much should be said in my book about the 1975 Charter of Rights adopted by the liberal government of Robert Bourassa, and also, and maybe more so, about the debate over the PQ project of Charter of Values that was in the news 2 years back. I think that, other than this, I could probably end my book with the foundation of the Cercle des Femmes Parlementaires in 2010 by the Liberal Party member Fatima Ouda Pépin. I know that this organization is still very active, and it aims to gather elected female officials to debate issues concerning women and human rights. So this is proof that civil and human rights are intimately linked in the view of these women, at least, and that women probably still feel today the need to do politics differently by going beyond the party lines they too often find limited.
So I have the privilege and the challenge to try to understand the suffrage movement in Ontario. And I'm not an Ontario historian, and so I'm trying to immerse myself in the history of Ontario at the same time. I think the traditional story of the history of suffrage in Ontario starts with the founding of the Toronto Women's Literary Club, which at the time in Ontario, it's estimated in the 19th century there was about 400 literary clubs across the province, one of the first actually being founded by African Canadian women in the Windsor and Chatham area. These were, perhaps the contemporary version of book clubs where women would gather together to study, to read history, literature, science. And in Toronto, what's unusual compared to what is known about the other organizations is that the Toronto Women's Literary Club also had a suffrage purpose to it. It was founded by Dr. Emily Stowe, one of Canada's first female doctors, who had been traveling in the United States, meeting with international associations of literary clubs, study groups, and some of the early American suffragists. And it has been argued that perhaps the literary club was perhaps a label given to hide some of the more radical activities that the women like Dr. Stowe were interested in pursuing for women's rights. So the club did meet, and they had dramatic performances and literary readings and speakers, but they also were very active in the 1870s and onward in pursuing rights for women. And that involved certainly circling around the vote, that the vote would be important symbolically and realistically for women to achieve equality in Ontario and Canada. They were also very interested in women's property rights, getting women elected municipally to offices such as the school board, as well as sort of local city councils. So the traditional story is this organization started in the 1870s, and over the next 40 years, pursued through traditional means of lobbying, petitions, meetings with the premier, meetings with suffragists in the United States and in the United Kingdom. The club transformed, and it openly became known as a suffrage group in 1883 when they changed their name to the Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association, and they had another name change later in the early 20th century as the group sort of split. So the traditional this is a very club-oriented movement in Ontario through organization, predominantly in the urban center. It often ends being described both contemporarily and sometimes in more recent secondary sources that when the women in Ontario won the vote in 1917, that it was a very quick and calm movement, that it only took 40 years for women to achieve the vote. And I think back, and I think for someone like Dr. Stowe, who didn't live to see the vote being won, though her daughter remained very active in the movement, taking over for her as a leader, I feel that we really need to go back and relook at what 40 years meant for women who were constantly speaking amongst themselves and networking together to discuss the issues, and constantly being turned back from the legislature and being told no, women didn't want the vote, women didn't need the vote, it was immoral. And although many of the women who were active in the movement in Ontario were very privileged and elite, they were also these very radical ideas, and they just said, I want to try and think about what was it like to fight for 40 years. And that they describe it as being calm in comparison, for example, to the more militant movement in Britain. But there's activity and activism that I think we could dissect a lot more. So my goal, first of all, is to understand Ontario and take it actually before the founding of the literary club, and to think about, much like in Quebec, what was it like in sort of Ontario's previous spaces, both in terms of being Upper Canada and in Canada West, and what was the climate at the time that sort of created, in many ways, a very strong Tory conservatism that was grounded in an imperial belief. Many of the original settlers of Ontario were loyalists coming from the United States, very strong commitment to the Britain and the British Empire. Yet on the other hand, we also had early on a call for responsible government and reform that was mainly framed in a quest for something like having proper elected representation, not control from an appointed council, and one that was focused on universal manhood suffrage, not women. But I think we think of Ontario often only as being that stronghold of sort of red Tory support, but there has been a reform element that came through in the Lower Canada Rebellion and other calls for reform, and thinking about what were the women's roles in this dialogue and discourse. Now, of course, despite there being a reform element in Ontario, I think it is fair to say from at least the Anglo-Protestant sort of dominance in the province that we did have a very conservative view of womanhood that was based on respecting and admiring women's domestic labor, their homemaking skills, their motherhood, but it had a very narrow view of what womanhood could be. And that was very sort of dominant in the early to mid 19th century in terms of what was the culture like in Ontario. So I think there was certainly, though, while this is a dominant representation at the time, we have challenges to that, whether it's in a figure like Queen Victoria, sort of being a leader of her nation and her empire, someone who is in many ways respecting this view of natural, traditional womanhood, yet could also be sort of seen as someone who might have other views. And we see sort of the rise of the new women in Ontario, women like Dr. Stowe, who were accessing things differently, looking for alternatives that wouldn't be represented in an image like this, joining professions, seeking education, wanting to be represented in sort of different vocations, whether it be in the church, whether it be in literature, journalism. And of course, we see no acknowledgement in this of sort of the laboring women who had been working for wages throughout the 19th century and before, of course. What I feel, although I have only had to deal with one province, and many of my colleagues are juggling multiple provinces and territories, I feel it will be really important in my book to understand the diversity of Ontario. So much of the literature about the movement is focused on Toronto, and of course we can't ignore the importance of this urban center that is where sort of a lot of cultural activities were taking place, education. It's where women were moving for work, for excitement, adventure. It's where a lot of other women's organizations were taking place, like the YMCA, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and we see sort of just, the convergence of people in this movement. That Toronto was definitely at the center of everything. But I think it is important to sort of think of Ontario, as Ontario often likes to do, thinking itself as the center of the universe. Toronto is not the center of Ontario necessarily. And the wide sort of distribution of smaller towns that are active, Hamilton, London, Kingston, that had networks of women that were sort of keyed into Toronto, but were doing their own things and active locally campaigning for the municipal vote. But also Ontario is predominantly, even in the late 19th century, still an agricultural community in which farm women are very active. And a little differently than in the prairies in terms of not necessarily as, in my own research so far, as sort of leading to more sort of the left-wing socialist farm women, but we do see even conservative women very active in their communities and organizing things like the Women's Institute, where they're focusing on, in some ways, women's the separate fear aspect of women, but still sort of giving women opportunities to organize and write about their ideas and activities and vision for their sex. One area that I really need to get more familiar with is the north of Ontario. We see so much of the activity documented in the suffrage crusade is along the southwestern border. And we see this is an era where the suffrage activity is happening in the urban areas and the sort of rural southwest. But we have railways and canals and everything bringing and opening up the north and industrialization and new sort of new pockets of communities that are growing. And within that, I think connected to the labor movement and unions and socialists, I'm hoping to find some connections that have yet to be sort of discovered about maybe a north-south sort of communication between women who are in different organizations, or if not, what else is happening? Is it too much of a frontier to be focused on the suffrage crusade? What are the issues that women are concerned about? And then finally thinking about Indigenous women in Ontario and sort of the different history of Indigenous sort of settlement in Ontario and the relationship, particularly among Six Nations women with with Great Britain. And I think this will be interesting to explore the different Indigenous groups in Ontario and their own sort of ways to access sort of political power for women, whether that's in traditional councils, elected councils, and relationships that Indigenous women had with these white activists, which were often in a very colonial context. But what were the connections being made? And I have some evidence from scholars that particularly in the First World War, we see some connections being made in terms of working together as opposed to being sort of white women working to not offering much sort of voice or support or opportunities to listen rather than to direct. I guess one of the other things I hope to pursue in this paper is really recognizing amid this small group of women who are active, and it is small, despite there being, we know a number of names and the stories of the women, proportionally to the population. This was a small collective of women, but they didn't all view suffrage the same, or feminism the same, or why it was important to get the vote. So briefly, I just want to give sort of example of 3 women who were active in Ontario. The first picture is of Margaret Haile, so she was born in Canada and spent a lot of time in the United Kingdom as well in the United States. She was an educated woman, a teacher, a journalist, and she was the first woman to stand for office for provincial parliament. So in 1902, as a member of the Canadian Socialist League, she stood up for provincial election, and she personally saw enfranchisement as important for women, for women's rights, but more importantly for getting the socialist cause represented. If we want to see my political vision put forward, we need to have women voting, and therefore to elect other socialists. She received 79 votes in that election, and I'd really like to know who were those 79 voters and understand a little bit more about her campaign. Another really interesting character is Flora MacDonald Dennison, who grew up sort of in a middle-class household that fell on hard times due to bankruptcy and sort of gambling from her family. So she's, though started off like many of the women, she had to become a working woman. And she started off she moved from Pictou, Ontario to Toronto, was a seamstress, eventually started out her own dressmaking business, was a mother separated from her husband, so was alone in Toronto as what we would describe today, sort of as a single mother, and became involved with the Stoves and Stowe Gullen and became very active in the suffrage crusade, became a journalist, had her own column. Although her own ideas were more radical than her cohort. She was expressing a lot of sympathy for the more militant movement in the United Kingdom, and therefore was asked to eventually step down as president of one of the suffrage associations because her ideas were seen as too divisive, and her her support, particularly in women, of working women as well, was not seen to be the mainstream message wanting that group to be dictated. And very finally, I just want to mention sort of one of the anti-suffragists that was very active, Adelaide Goodless, who grew up in St. George, Ontario. She was very active in probably in many organizations you might be familiar with in founding. The Women's Institute, the National Council of Women of Canada, the Volunteer Association of Nurses. She was active in the Hamilton YWCA, and she was probably best known for lobbying for domestic science to be added to the university curriculum. But she was very much against suffrage. She thought there was distinct gender roles for men and women. And as much as she encouraged women to be part of the public world and be contributors to their communities, she did not think the vote was the way to achieve it. Interestingly enough, she also, the only thing she hated more than suffrage was prohibition. So trying to sort of understand these women who were in these various circles and understand why and why not that they were trying to achieve the vote, and think about their male allies and the opposition. Finally, I think it is important to understand why was suffrage achieved in Ontario. It was achieved in April 1917, a year later than the Prairies and the Western provinces. And what was it about the timing? What helped achieve the vote? When we read sort of the debates in Parliament and in the press, it is sort of assuming, part of it is the First World War and women's war work. Part of it is the pressure from the Western provinces that Ontario needs to perhaps now not be falling behind the frontier in Canada. And then it's sort of the pressures coming from Britain and the United States. I really want to see if there's a way to understand what was about the timing. Was it the individuals in office at the time, the enormous sort of 4 decades worth of activism leading up to this moment, and trying to understand why Ontario came at that moment. And I think, like all of us, are trying to think about after the vote. Obviously, there was not sort of an immediate revolution in politics when they were not sort of beating down the doors of Parliament. So what happened in the subsequent decades in terms of women's fight for equality, political representation? And very quickly, I'll just leave you with sort of the experiences of 4 women. Constance Hamilton was a Toronto suffragette who later stood for Toronto City Council in 1920. So when the province won the right to vote, also municipal success was possible. So Constance is on City Council in 1920, very soon after. Then we have someone like Elsie Knott, an Ojibwe woman, part of the Curve Lake Ojibwas in Mississauga First Nation. She was the first chief elected, a first woman chief elected. And so we're moving, this is in the 1950s, what would sort of be the space for sort of using elected sort of representation, and what sort of vision would sort of this, can we look at this as a gendered change? What would sort of be her vision for her community? And sort of again acknowledging sort of Ontario's high immigrant population, a woman like Jean Lum, who was a Chinese-Canadian activist, and although after Chinese Canadians had access to the vote, in terms of citizenship, it was changing immigration laws that would allow for family reunions and to end quotas towards immigration. So someone who was accessing sort of political influence through other channels beyond the vote. And then someone, in a more contemporary example, Judy Rebeck, an anti-poverty activist, the idea that there was continuing sort of modes of activity and political campaigns that did not end, and that there was activity in every sort of decade post the suffrage achievement. And although I don't have her on there, I thought perhaps there would be some way to end the Ontario collection with looking at a figure like Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario now. So we're looking at 100 years later, after women received the vote in Ontario, we have an openly gay female premier, someone who doesn't necessarily put that in front of her identity, but is very quiet and accepted. So looking at sort of the changes over this sort of 140 years that we're looking at, and what is being achieved, what has not, what is known, what is not. We'll just leave that there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my responsibility to talk about Atlantic Canada, and as in the other provinces, suffrage didn't drop out of the sky, despite what some may tell you. I have some examples here of social justice and political activity before the vote. Nova Scotia women, for example, could vote up to 1851 when they began to be excluded. Women, especially loyalist women, so in the late 18th century, were very successful petitioners to the government, particularly for pensions and other, usually funds that related to their losses during the American Revolution. In Nova Scotia, there was a married women's property law in 1866. There was one in New Brunswick in 1895. Also in Atlantic Canada, there's a long tradition of women's education, higher education. Mount Allison, Dalhousie, and Acadia all had early entrance, comparatively, for women. And Mount Allison in particular graduated the first woman in the British Empire, Grace Annie Lockhart, in 1875. Suffrage itself was a long struggle in Atlantic Canada. It ebbed and flowed in various periods. These are the dates when it was actually achieved for most women. But there are certain periods of intensity followed by low points. The 1890s were, in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the most intense periods. And in fact, in Nova Scotia, suffrage was voted in by the legislature in 1895, but got hung up, it failed in committee 3 months later. So Nova Scotia came close in 1895. You'll note on this chart that in New Brunswick, there was a 15-year delay for women to hold office, eligibility to hold office. And another comment about Newfoundland is that there were additional restrictions based on age. For women had to be 25 to vote. And we tie that, we assume that there are connections with Britain in that case that had similar age restrictions. Of course, Newfoundland was a colony of Britain until 1949. We don't have, unfortunately, a recent synthesis of the movement in Atlantic Canada. What we have is a 65-year-old book, Catherine Cleaverton. We're still using it in Atlantic Canada, and it is mixed. Of course it's 65 years old. She did think that Atlantic Canada was painfully conservative, and here's a couple of quotations. She names the chapter, the Maritimes, the stronghold of conservatism. She is including Newfoundland, but she refers to the Maritimes. And her first sentence in this chapter is, nowhere has the traditional conservatism of the Maritime provinces been more apparent than in securing the political rights for women. And a little farther down on the page, she said it was natural that these provinces should exhibit varying shades of apathy. 2 decades after Cleaverton wrote her book, this on your left, this book by Carol Backey said little about the Maritimes and Newfoundland. It kind of glossed over Newfoundland, and that was very quickly responded to by Ernie Forbes. This is a selection of essays, I think, that really represent his life's work, and his life's work is to challenge the regional stereotype. And in this book, he has a 9-page response to Backey's book, and it's pretty scathing. He does not want to, and he doesn't let her have the last word. Just one quotation from Forbes' criticism of Backey. It's a multi-layered one. He thinks she gives too much emphasis to class. He's not sure she really understands the movement. He takes apart her footnotes, and in that third sentence I might just expand and say, what he says is her 156 examples of suffragists, she generalizes and says that they are very well educated. He says fewer than half of them he's found do have university degrees. He says you wouldn't hide a university degree at this point. Therefore, what he's inserting into this debate is a question about whether it wasn't actually a much more working class movement, something I'd really like to follow up on. The one thing Forbes does like is that Cleaverton presents a regional analysis, and he says that's the only way to understand this. And you'll notice that's what we're doing. He'd be happy. Now, in the years that followed women's suffrage, there continued to be human rights violations, you might say, or certainly human rights issues connected to the vote. I think that the most obvious in Atlantic Canada is the suspension of democracy in Newfoundland from 34 to 49. This is a photograph of the inauguration of the commission government, those 6 commissioners who ran Newfoundland for about 15 years. This was after Newfoundland had accumulated debt, first through the railway, then through its contributions to World War I, and then thirdly through the Depression. When Newfoundland defaulted on its loans, Britain stepped in very quickly and appointed a commission government, 3 British commissioners and 3 Newfoundland commissioners. So it's sobering to remember that no one had the vote in Newfoundland for these years. Other ethnically based human rights issues relate to Acadians, First Nations, and African Nova Scotians. These are examples. The Acadians, after being allowed to return to the Maritimes after the deportation, so in the 1780s, there is a consistent history of poor access to education and health care. Premier Robichaud in the 1960s attempted to bring in and was, I think, quite successful in bringing in a program of equal opportunity that has real comparisons with the Quiet Revolution. It culminated in New Brunswick's becoming Canada's only bilingual province. So a New Brunswick example, here's a Nova Scotia example, also one that goes well back into the 18th century. The African Nova Scotians many of them are linked to loyalist immigrants. The example of Africville, a slum in Halifax within city limits, has come to epitomize the poor treatment of African Nova Scotians. From the 1850s up until 1962, this community did not have running water, did not have proper sewage systems, and the city refused again and again to provide them and never did address it, instead evicted the tenants in 1962. This is a national issue, of course, Bill C-31, the issue of First Nations women losing their status when they married non-First Nations men. It happens that the woman who took the case to the United Nations is a New Brunswick woman. She's now a senator, Sandra Lovelace. So another very obvious example, and of course the broader example that First Nations people weren't voting until a few years before that. I think that the main thing that I'm going to have to address in my volume is how conservative, if at all, were Atlantic Canadians and were the issues around suffrage. And I'm quite frustrated by things being so measured by dates. I'm not sure that a place that earned suffrage a few years later than another place was behind. I think that's awfully chronological. And I just give PEI as an example. Yes, it's much later, but look what happened in 1993. All of the so-called top positions in the province, the premier, the leader of the opposition, the sergeant at arms, the lieutenant governor, they were all women. So that had to have roots somewhere, didn't it? That didn't drop out of the sky any more than suffrage did. So these are some of the things that I'll be addressing. Thank you.
I'm the caboose here on this train. So, creating an overview is a daunting prospect, certainly a challenging one in many ways. How does one write an overview of suffrage that necessarily generalizes without becoming overly general? How does one link the question of suffrage to other issues of inequality? How does one raise issues of class and race concerning a movement that's often perceived as simply white, liberal, middle class? How does one recognize the regional, linguistic, and cultural differences within the movement without balkanizing the story and still keeping Canada in its international context?